Joining us now is Ambassador Dennis Ross, Counselor, and William Davidson, Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and an NBC News Foreign Affairs analyst. Also with us is Ambassador Alon Pinkas, former Israeli Consul General in New York. Ambassador Ross, what do you make of Netanyahu's objectives here in Washington, D.C. today? He comes at a very kind of unusual time.
Well, there's no doubt about that. I suspect that when the timing of this was originally agreed upon, one of his hopes was that he would command the attention of the Capitol and be able to use the platform of the speech to the Congress to try to recast the narrative and focus very heavily on what Israel is doing and the reality that in fighting Hamas, it's fighting an enemy that no country would accept as existing next door to them. Now, he's here instead in an environment where to say that there's a distraction, to say that the focus is much more on the political realities and the new reality of President Biden no longer running for re-election, that's certainly something he couldn't affect, and it obviously limits, I think, the level of attention here. But it won't change his desire, I think, to reframe the narrative, that to focus on what Israel is fighting, to create a sense that Israel very much appreciates the scope of American support. I think very much he wants to recast the whole U.S.-Israeli relationship in a nonpartisan reality. I mean, historically, there hasn't been a Republican approach to Israel, a Democratic approach to Israel, a Republican interest in Israel, or a Democratic interest in Israel. There's been an American one. And I think he wants to sort of, in a sense, re-highlight that. That certainly is going to be part of his message. I think we will see him take the high road. He'll thank President Biden. He'll thank the Congress for the support. But he'll also say that Israel is basically fighting a fight that is also America's fight, given who Hamas is and the fact that Iran is sort of the key player, stoking all the instability in the region and trying to take advantage of the conflicts that exist.
Ambassador Pinkas, you signed a letter with a bipartisan group of officials who worked in the Israeli government and are concerned about Netanyahu's visit to the U.S. What are your concerns?
Well, there are few people on this planet, Jose, not to mention Washington, who know the Middle East better and know Israel better and know Benjamin Netanyahu better than Dennis Ross. However, I have to disagree with him. I think this is a political trip. It was done in collusion with Republicans who wanted to highlight Democratic divisions about Israel for the last 9 months. Mr. Netanyahu has spent the better part of the last decade trying to turn Israel deliberately into a partisan issue. But I think that in terms of why is he coming to Congress, well, look, this is a prime minister who is facing a war on 3 fronts, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and with the Houthis in Yemen, who has 120 hostages being held in Gaza, which he has not, in good faith, negotiated the release of. And the question is, why the hell are you going to Congress? This is a Congress that already authorized $14.3 billion. The administration, the Biden administration, did everything that you want. The Republicans that supported it. Why are you going there? It's all about politics. On the flip side, he has his domestic audience and a domestic agenda to show that he still has his mojo, that he still can walk around Washington and garner some respect and attention. I'll wait to see. I agree with Dennis, with Ambassador Ross, that he's going to try and take the high road, although that's going to be very untypical of him. But he will try to do so because of the timing and because of Biden's decision to withdraw. But let's not forget, he is going on Friday to meet Donald Trump. If this isn't political, then what is?
And that's something that I want to ask Ambassador Ross about, because he is the Prime Minister of Israel going to be meeting with Trump separately, as he's going to be meeting as well with the president and with the vice president. Is that a fine line, or is this as Alon says, just the Prime Minister of Israel walking into a political line?
Well, he is walking into a political climate that, to say the least, is highly charged. So the idea that he would have come here seen President Biden, seen Vice President Harris, and then not seen Trump, that would have been, I think, problematic for him as well. So I think what we're seeing is he's trying to show a nonpartisan, bipartisan approach. Obviously, this is in contrast to what he did in 2015 when he came and spoke to a joint session of the Congress. And that was to appeal, in a sense, to the Congress over the head of the president in opposition to President Obama's approach at that point, negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. This time around, this is a very different context. The need for bipartisan support is greater than ever for Israel at a time when, certainly within parts of the Democratic Party, there is more criticism and questioning of Israel than we've ever seen before. So on the one hand, he certainly wants to stake out a position that is the high road, that emphasizes nonpartisanship. And at the same time, he's in a highly polarized political climate here. So he's obviously trying to, I think, deal with both these elements. And what Alon said, I don't disagree with. He certainly has a political objective with Israel in mind as well. Coming here and speaking to a joint session of Congress is designed to demonstrate that he still commands a certain stage within the United States, and pretty hard to see anybody else in his mind, or certainly what he's trying to convey, who could do the same thing. And he is, look, there's enormous polarization within Israel right now, notwithstanding the war, and certainly partly because it's not clear exactly what the day after strategy is, partly because of issues that Alon was raising about the negotiation effort to get the hostages released.